there.
Hi.
We are the
Dyslexia Duo.
Each week, we sit down with amazing people, including top researchers and experts in dyslexia, powerful advocates, affected individuals, and more.
Together, we break down the myths, share real stories, highlight research and strategies to advise our listeners about this prevalent learning disability. Come join us!
Hey, Melissa.
Hey, Aimee.
So today we have a very special guest, and I joke around. I always say, oh my gosh, I say this every week. We always have a very special guest, but this is like the white whale moment for me. So I'm very excited to have this guest on here. So will you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell our audience who you are and what you do?
My name is Mark Seidenberg. I am a cognitive scientist, neuroscientist who has studied reading and language for many years. I am now retired from my academic position at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And thanks for sharing my retirement with me. I'm still active doing various things related to reading and trying to make the best use of reading research and in teaching children to read.
Amazing.
The research doesn't really stop, does it?
I think academics, some people don't really retire. You don't have your faculty meetings and you're not teaching classes, but I know very few people who just went off to Florida and were never heard from again. It's easy to be active and it's engaging. And of course, the issues in reading aren't resolved. They keep going and there's quite a lot to talk about.
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I retired after 30 years in public ed. And Melissa retired, but are we really retired? No, we both have our own businesses. Yeah.
I guess you can relate. Yes, for sure.
Yeah. For sure.
I thought that you were far too young to be retired. That was obviously I was doing some stereotyping there. I'm very sorry.
No. Oh, no, I like that kind of stereotyping.
Yes. Yeah, we prefer that.
Greatest kind. My kids will every once in a while go, what's that sparkly stuff in your hair? Just go away. I know what this.
It's pretty scary when you have a kid who's near 30 and you don't feel like you're even old enough to have somebody near 30. Like it's pretty wild.
I know the feeling exactly.
Yeah, or mine is in the 30s. Anyway, I digress. So we were talking about your book, Language at the Speed of Sight. And I remember buying it as a younger teacher because I was like, this is great stuff. And it really has some great information. So it is very much foundational to literacy reform. But what prompted you to write Language at the Speed of Sight? And I keep almost saying Language at the Speed of Sound, like the Coldplay song. But what inspired you to write Language at the Speed of Sight?
Well, a couple of things. One thing is, I think when you think about reading research, which includes a lot of disciplines and topics like there's reading itself, but there's language, there's learning, there's the social aspects of expectations about literacy, the social context and socioeconomic context in which kids learn. There's been a huge amount of progress in studying these things. And I was interested in writing a book that conveyed at least some of the most interesting stuff to a broad range of readers. I think 8 chapters of the book are about the science. And I think it's really interesting science. And I was trying to really turn as many people onto it as I could because it's out there and it's interesting. I also wrote 3 chapters that were more about the connection between the science and the real world. And I really wanted to have both parts. In hindsight, I could have just written a book that was the last 3 chapters because that's what a lot of people read. It was the part in which I really critiqued what was going on in terms of how kids were being taught and the fact that there was this disconnection between the research and what people believed about reading and how that was being used in the classroom. So, I could have, in retrospect, just written a book about that. But I really wanted to have the scientific foundation out there in the first part of the book before I said anything about, okay, now let's look at the relationship between what this research says and what's happening in classrooms. I needed to have both parts. And part of it was just from frustration. And I've said this many times. I think the research is one of the really crown jewels in cognitive science, the study of human intelligent behavior. Their progress has been fantastic. And yet, if the science is so great, how come there's so many people who struggle to read? I really wanted to engage both the science and the real world problems.
So do you think it's that maybe educators who don't know how to apply the science of reading adequately? And we're talking like at tier 2 settings. Do you think that
Well,
could be it?
I think there's a great deal of enthusiasm about making use of research in dealing with the challenges of teaching kids to read and also helping kids who struggle for one reason or another, especially. I think we all know that background knowledge is really crucial to understanding. And for reasons that I discuss in the book, having to do with the history of departments of education at universities and so on, there very few teachers will have gotten much background about this research as part of their pre-service training. And that's true. It's still true. So it's not that people can't understand, it's that they don't have the background knowledge to absorb a great deal. And so there's a kind of disconnect between the excitement over making use of all of this research and trying to prove outcomes, but also some limits because people haven't heretofore had the background to really be able to absorb very much of it. So this is a continuing issue. It has to do with how teachers are trained, taught in professional training that they receive, and it's something I really want to continue to push on because it's important.
We have actually talked quite a bit about teacher prep, getting them ready. And so I graduated with my bachelor's in 91, and it was a leading teacher college out here in the DFW area. And I remember going into my first classroom and having not a clue as to how to teach these sixth graders how to read. And here I am, they're sixth grade, and it was a small little country district. And I had a lot of non-readers, non-spellers there. And I thought, okay, what do I do now? Because I can't just do flashcards for everything. How do I teach them? Because I didn't know how to teach them how to unblend a word for reading it and all of that. And now the turn that we're seeing, the swing of the pendulum, we're seeing a lot more with morphology and background knowledge that needs to be imparted to our kids. So yeah, I do agree that it has a lot to do with teacher prep and a lot of our teachers coming out, and not just from alt certs, but from college, not understanding what to do.
Yeah, I think the really unfortunate thing that I don't feel hesitant about, calling out, because it's not about the teachers, it's not about the people who go into the field, but it's about the way the universities and colleges are teaching people. I think it was a little bit more philosophical, and it was giving people, traditionally it gives, maybe this is consistent with your experience, people are taught that there's no one way to teach reading, and you'll just have to figure out what works for you in your setting and with your kids. And there were two consequences of that. One was what you just described. Teachers would show up on the job and literally not really know what to do. The other thing, or know very little, I should say. The other thing was it created a dependence on the curricula. So a lot of people learned about reading and teaching kids to read from the curricula that were adopted, which came with the curriculum author or teams of authors' philosophy about how to do things and their personal view of things. And of course, they came with lots of teacher ed materials and a teacher's guide and additional support that teachers really needed because they needed some guidance about what to do. That unfortunately left them vulnerable to the people who were promoting these various commercial curricula, and they were vulnerable to, were these people credible, and are the things that they were promoting and saying actually accurate? Were they true? So I think the insufficiency of the undergraduate pre-service kind of training, by that I mean, professional training, like a lawyer gets professional training, created this dependence on the gurus of curricula. And that turns out to have been something that we need to change, because teachers need to be able to judge these things more on their own and know whether what they're being sold a bill of goods or not.
Right.
Right. And the gurus of the curricula don't necessarily have the best interest of the child in front of them.
I don't like to talk about their motivations because I don't really know them. I do know that the people who formulate these approaches have a great deal of personal competence. They do, in most cases, I think, have the interests of teachers in mind, but they might themselves not have very much of the relevant sorts of background. For example, how do children learn? There are modern accounts of how people learn and how they make use of experience in different ways. And you look at the materials that are commercially promoted, and they don't really engage that stuff very much at all. I would just say that it left people vulnerable to experts who might not actually have had all of the relevant sorts of knowledge themselves.
That makes sense. So then if we're thinking about your term that you used to title your book, Language at the Speed of Sight, what does that really mean in terms of cognitive neuroscience and how kids learn to read?
I was trying to emphasize, first of all, it was very hard to come up with a title. I'm terrible at titles. I wanted to call the book Reading Matters, but my publisher thought that was a little, people wouldn't really go for that. I think the main point about reading is that it's this interesting intersection between a particular code, the written kind of code, and language, right? It's a form of language. And most of the important issues about reading actually have their origins in language. And so the book is about certain properties of spoken language and how spoken language works and is acquired and so on. And then how did we get to print? And how does the use of this different medium change things? And I'm glad you mentioned that because I think the title does emphasize the really centrality of language to reading. And that I think is something to keep in mind.
Yeah, we've talked a lot too about oral language and how important that oral language is to the development of reading. And I think that where I can see some difficulties in some of my students is the lacking of their oral language development. And
what do you mean by that? I really find that quite interesting. Could you say a little bit more about that, maybe?
Sure. I have some students who I have worked with in the past who might not have the concept of proper noun verb agreement. They might not have the proper exposure to vocabulary words, what maybe might help make a sentence make sense when they're trying to write something of that nature.
And are we how old are we talking about kids from young to older?
Elementary age.
I think one of the things that really is a discovery from the last 20 or 30 years of research is just how much kids' spoken language development varies. It varies a lot more than people initially realized. And that variation has an impact on their experience in school. And in particular, it has an impact on their ability to benefit from instruction about reading. See, when I was in my younger days, it was the peak period where Noam Chomsky was saying language is this universal property. And yes, people talk different languages. And yes, people have different vocabularies and stuff. And their language differs. But all of that is really trivial. Because in his view, the thing that really mattered was the commonalities, the kind of universal properties. And so for decades, people who studied language followed him in saying, we don't really need to look that closely at how language is used in the real world or the way that kids vary, because that's all just secondary to him. It turns out that was wrong, because the variability in kids' experience and the variability in what they learn about language is huge. It happens for a variety of reasons, right? It happens because there are differences in the quality of the language in the home, depending on the education level of the parents and other things. But it differs for other reasons. It differs because the child might be bilingual, or they might have more than one language in their environment. And there are several different reasons why kids' knowledge of spoken language varies at the start of school. And we had underestimated this before. And I blame Chomsky. Now, of course, people study it a great deal, and the research there is beautiful, and it's really compelling.
It really is. I think about one of the guests we did have who was speaking about oral language, and she said it can just be as easy as talking about going to a grocery store and talking about what on the shelves. Is this purple? What else is purple? Just talking about different things in the store or your surroundings.
Yeah. So one of the things that's really crucial is what's the language that the kid hears? And there were famous early studies on this that were looking at there's different amounts of conversation or whatever in the home, but kids' exposure to language does vary. But the thing I think has really been underestimated still is to this day is what you've just mentioned, which is encouraging the kids' own speech. So it's not just that they aren't receiving as much input, it's that they're not being encouraged to speak. My colleague and wife, Mary Ellen McDonald, is the authority on speech production and its role in memory learning and other things. She has her own book about that. And she has really completely converted me to the idea that it's not just what the kid hears, it's actually encouraging them to make use of the language in production, in speaking. The reason being, speaking is actually quite a bit more difficult. It's more challenging. It requires more attention and effort than just sitting there and letting language wash over you. And I've been in classrooms and in schools where the classrooms were quiet. The important thing was maintaining control and keeping everyone orderly. And so children were only encouraged to speak when they were asked a specific question. No, this is the wrong thing. We want to have them talking and interacting with each other and with an adult who knows more of the language than they do. So the talking part is really crucial, and I think still is underestimated. But the net effect of these different experiences is that kids are in different places when it comes to starting to learn to read.
Absolutely. So we kind of talked on this next topic a little bit, and we said there's this disconnect in college with what kids need to know to be taught to for good reading, not just phonology and decoding, but for overall comprehension. But why do you think there's a disconnect in education from scientific research? And how did that divide develop, do you think?
I'll answer that question, but I want to get back to the question that of what is it that kids really need to be taught?
Right.
And where are the important differences? And how can we ameliorate them? But the first question is, how did the disconnect occur? It's a historical thing. Everybody's at fault here. It has to do with how schools of education developed in the early 20th century. And at a lot of the Ivy League schools and some of the Big Ten schools and other big universities, there was real concern about ambivalence about establishing a discipline related to education. There were people who thought it wasn't scientific, that it couldn't be studied, and they were very academic kind of battles over, should we have a Department of Education? Should we treat it like psychology and mathematics and chemistry and say there should be, a science, and we're trying to promote research in this area? There was quite a lot of ambivalence about it. And some schools, in fact, started ed schools in the early 20th century and then closed them down. But the net result was on a lot of campuses, certainly my own and many others, the School of Education ended up being its own sort of island. And it was separate from and distinct from administratively and philosophically from the departments where a lot of relevant stuff was being studied in psychology and in linguistics and in other fields where a lot of really important research was going on that could be made use of in teaching teachers and developing curricula and so on. But people were literally on different parts of the campus. And the educators developed their own approaches and tried to develop their own identities. And the scientists were happy to let them do what they wanted. That's a simplification, but there is this long history of education being treated differently on campuses from these other disciplines. And it comes down to even where they're located on campus in a lot of places.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I can remember, again, when I was getting my bachelor's, because when I got my master's and beyond, doing that online. So you didn't even know. But in the 90s, when I was getting my bachelor's, the College of Education, we were kind of way off on the outskirts of the campus, and maybe the art building was next to us. That's it.
This continues to be an issue, if I could say. It's something we should really try to overcome. One of the questions is, so there's a great deal of enthusiasm for connecting basic research and cognition to education, that would be a good thing. We aren't doing it that well yet. In the past, people thought this wasn't relevant. They said, look, that's lab research, it's ivory tower kind of stuff. It doesn't really have anything to do with the real world. Now people are willing to agree, yeah, this stuff is relevant, but it's hard to connect. And even in the schools of education where they would like to implement, change pre-service education, they often don't have the resources to do it. And they often can't duplicate things that are offered elsewhere on campus. So I personally think this is a case where having some basic undergraduate courses in things like developmental psychology and a linguistics 101 course and a cognition course, there's a few things that could be offered. And you can't expect every school of education to be able to mount that program. There has to be some cross-disciplinary discussion, cooperation to give people access to these courses, because often they're available elsewhere on campus. So crossing the bridges is still a big issue.
I agree with that.
I agree. And I think that this is just my own feelings, but I believe that if education were valued the way that it really should be valued, I think that there would be a lot more money and resources poured into those types of programs so that the educators could get educated the way that they need to. Yeah.
Sure. Again, this goes back to these historical events that I referred to before. It is indeed why on a lot of campuses, education was treated as a second-class operation, because they said, oh, this isn't really science, but we need it, so we'll let them do it. I don't believe any of that, but I think historically that's what happened. I believe that what's happening right now is that people are relying on professional development courses as a way to bring teachers up to speed. I don't actually think that's adequate. And I do think that ultimately the teacher education programs have to change. And if they don't have the resources to do it themselves, which is quite likely, then we need to have national courses, or we need to have online courses that are certified and make it possible for people from different programs to sign up. Academia gets into a lot of bureaucracy. And I've thought in the past about trying to get a course. I used to offer a course at the University of Wisconsin-Madison about the science of reading and its educational implications, where I really brought these two things together. I said to the people at the university over the years, well, this is something that would be useful nationally. There aren't many courses of this sort. Is there some way to put it out there so that someone can sign up, get credit, and so on? Never solved that problem. Never.
Oh, man.
My own university certainly didn't make it possible. I still think there is that need. You can't expect every school of education or teachers' college to have the expertise and the faculty and to mount all these courses. There's got to be a way to share the load.
And I think that might be because people in leadership roles might truly not understand the science of reading. So maybe you can explain to our listeners the science of reading, what it takes to get somebody to read.
You're not going to make me answer that in 5 minutes. I think people can understand the appeal of what we're talking about very easily. Learning to read. What do you need to know in order to understand how children learn to read, and then how to help them learn to read? And so what do you need to know? You need to know something about how reading works. And reading is a complicated human accomplishment. And so we can talk about how reading works. We can talk about learning. We can talk about how it builds on language. There is research on all of these things. And I'm not talking about little tiny results about some little factoid. I think if you look at the literature, you could pull out some very basic and true conclusions about how does learning to read proceed, why do people have difficulties, and what are the ways to ameliorate them. So it's basically any research that bears on these questions of how does reading work, how can we effectively teach reading, and how do we deal with the variation that we see in terms of kids who catch on versus ones who really struggle. Is that a good enough answer, or did you want something more specific?
I always like to hear from you guys that know exactly how it happens, because we know it's not a natural process. We know it's not something that everybody has to learn how to do it.
Yeah, could we talk about that natural stuff for a second?
Yes.
Yes.
So there was a guy named Phil Goff, who's still alive, but has been retired for many years. He was at the University of Texas at Austin, and he was a wise guy in a lot of ways. And most people in reading know his work through the simple view, because he was the guy who said the simple view of reading. He was being sort of a smart guy. But one of his other papers was called Learning to Read an Unnatural Act. Ha ha. And it made this point that you're repeating, which is, well, learning to talk, you don't have to teach a kid that there's this thing, language, and you need to listen to the sounds. Basically, kids are set up to learn to talk in an appropriate environment where they can hear and speak. And reading definitely is different, quote unquote, unnatural, in the sense that to get off the ground, the learner definitely requires instruction, right? A beginning reader's got to learn that there is this thing called reading, and that there are these kinds of symbols. And then they're going to find out that, oh, that stuff that's written actually relates to things they know from speech. At the outset, they are quite different, learning to talk and learning to read. However, after that, it's possible to overstate how much they differ, because most of what people learn when they're learning a spoken language is learned through this use of language. There is some instruction, like when toddlers are learning language, we teach them lots of names for things and colors and sounds and animals and so on. And there is instruction that goes on. But the point of that instruction is just enabling the kid to learn very quickly from all sorts of experiences using language and hearing it and so on. Reading is initially different in the sense that you have to teach the kid about print and get them going. But just like in spoken language, most of what you learn, most of what supports learning to read is also learned without explicit instruction. That is, you teach kids some words, but you don't teach them all the words. Mm-hmm. You teach them some patterns, phonics patterns, but you don't teach them all the patterns, because if the child gets off the ground, Goff had this phrase called breaking the code. He thought of print as a code, and the idea was the goal of early instruction was break the code. The kids got to figure out understand what there is, how the system works, and have learned enough about it to be able to go, oh, and start learning from other kinds of experiences, including their own reading. So, once you've broken the code, once you've got a foundation and understand what there is to learn, then you can start learning from a lot of other activities, not just explicit instruction. That other kind of learning is called implicit or statistical learning. That's the thing that powers learning a spoken language. So yes, they differ at the outset, where reading absolutely requires explicit instruction, but the goal is to enable this implicit learning, which is actually very similar for both print and language. So I think it's unnatural at one stage, but it's just at that stage where you're really, that crucial stage at the beginning where you really do have to provide adequate instruction to help the kid understand how the code works. Yep, that is the place where they differ. However, in most of the rest of development, they're actually quite similar in that you learn through the activities themselves, using spoken language and reading and spell and writing. I know this is surprising for a lot of people, but I think it is something that people will begin to realize.
And I think you're right. I think it's just a matter of, I hate to say lead the horse to water, but the more times we lead the horse to water, they're going to understand it a little bit. So we talked about how complex reading is, but reading should be automatic. But what should be in place for that automaticity with reading to start to develop or be developed?
Yeah, this is a great question. I should say my comments on this are based on observations about learning, mainly, and not observations taken from having tried out various curricula or anything like that. And when I say these things, they're simplified in some ways, and they're not taking into account a lot of realities of what happens in the classroom. So I just want to say that. Basically, I think the point of teaching kids to read is to teach them to read. And where reading is, it's not a sort of trick question. It's like, what is reading? Well, they need to be able to recognize words and understand them, and they need to be able to recognize sequences of words that form phrases and sentences and so on, and integrate those words together to form the meaning of what's being read. I think the focus needs to be on doing things that enable children to read, where that's measured by these kinds of things I just mentioned. how do kids start to read? This is the million-dollar question. In my view, you need to focus on, well, what is reading? At the outset, it's sounding words out and beginning to recognize individual words and even words in isolation, say, and learning enough words and doing that enough to begin to generalize. So you've learned certain kinds of spelling patterns and phonics patterns, and you've learned how to sound certain words out. Now you're getting good at it. You can just look at the word and say it. The child needs a foundation. And with a sufficient foundation, then they can start to generalize. They can start to look at new patterns that they haven't seen before and figure them out with maybe some instruction, but not a huge amount, not as much as at the outset, because they can extend what they've already learned and incorporate the new stuff pretty smoothly. You know, there was the Russian psychologist named Vygotsky, who coined this famous phrase, the zone of proximal development, where you know something and then there's something new to learn, and it's not too different from what you already know to be able to learn it, and it's not too similar to what you already know, because that's not interesting. It's in a sweet spot where you can take what you know and generalize to new patterns and new examples. I think we're trying to put the kid in the zone of proximal development for things like phonics, where we teach them enough, they grasp enough, they've succeeded enough in reading words. And now, if you give them something that's a little bit outside of what they've been taught, they can absorb it pretty quickly. And over time, they can do more and more of the learning from reading with less and less feedback. It's not that there's no feedback, it's just that they are just dependent on explicitly being taught each pattern separately. So I think the point is to get them in the zone where they can start to generalize and learn from a variety of reading experiences, not just from explicit instruction where you're told, here's a pattern, let's practice the pattern, and so on.
So perhaps putting them in decodable readers or readers that are on their level, things of that nature.
Certainly, my understanding of decodable readers would say, yeah, those texts include words that they know, and then some percentage of ones that are in the zone, but they're going to have to figure out. So in general, they are consistent with this idea. How exactly to do decodable readers and so on is a different question we don't have to get into.
Okay.
Well, how do sight words fit into all of that?
Yeah.
Oh, that's such a really interesting question. So I see lots of people on the curriculum side focusing on various ways to teach the easy patterns, right? Phonics is all about, like, here's the ones that form that for which there's a pattern, right? And you can describe this pattern as a rule, and the kid can learn the rule. And as we all know, some of English is like that, but written English, but a lot of it isn't. So we have all these irregular words. And I don't see as many people innovating around those things as, gee, we're spending so much time figuring out the best way to teach phonics. I feel like we can nail that one. But what are we going to do about all those irregular words? Because they really are a burden at the beginning. They're very common words, and it's very hard to read in a sensible text without them. I have my understanding of that based on my own research and other research dating back quite a long time is somewhat different than what's currently being done. What's currently being done is people say, there's only a couple possibilities. How are you going to teach those words? One is you can just say, look, we're going to have to memorize a few of these every week, because how are you going to teach the kid how to pronounce once or these words that have irregular pronunciations? And so you see a lot of curricula. You should correct me, if you know more about this than me, but the curricula are teaching some phonics patterns, and then they also have the special words of the week. So people don't like that because they say, well, it's memorizing, and memorizing is really hard. And it's true, memorizing is hard, and just rote memorizing without any kind of system to it is really hard. So as far as I can tell, that's one approach. Another approach I've seen recently is people try to develop rules that govern some of these patterns. So do you know the rule? Are you familiar with the rule about why words like have and give have short vowels? Because no syllable can end in V, and therefore the E is just there because there can't be a V there, but actually it's not making the vowel long. You can try to teach the kid this rule, and now you have a rule that will apply to have and give and a few others. So now I see that as an approach. People are trying to write rules that will specify the pronunciations of some of these irregular words. I don't like it. I don't think it's the best alternative. The problem with all those rules is you have to memorize the rule. It's not a replacement for memorizing. It's memorizing something else. The other terrible problem with that approach is those rules only capture a small number of cases. There are always other exceptions to them.
Right.
And in order to make a rule like that work, you have to memorize the rule and you have to kind of know which words it applies to and which ones it doesn't. And by the time you're done learning all of that, it's not a big win. It's actually very laborious. It's slow. And the kid has to remember the rule and does it apply to this word or not? So those are the two main alternatives that I understand. I have a third alternative. My third alternative is it's instruction that's based on similarity. So you're trying to look at words, and across words, words are similar to one another, right? They overlap in different ways. They overlap in many ways. They might overlap partially. They might overlap in everything except the vowel or everything except the initial consonant and so on. People are really good at learning based on similarity if they're given the opportunity. So when people talk about statistical learning is based on similarity. So in my view, the way to teach a lot of the irregular words is not by giving people a rule, because that gets into all sorts of other problems. It's just grouping them in ways so that they reinforce one another. That is, there are all of those irregular words, sight words, so on and so on. None of them are completely arbitrary. They always overlap with some other words. And so a way to teach them is to group those words together, not teaching kids that there's a rule about them, that you don't need the cover story. You need to teach them together and have them use the words in sentences and texts and so on, so that those words reinforce one another. And it's a little bit different than teaching them an overt rule, which has other baggage. So a lot of the irregular words can indeed be grouped with other words in ways that makes them help each other. And learning based on similarity and grouping these words together, not based on whether you think they're a phonics word, governed word, or whether they're a sight word, just on the basis of do they overlap in ways that kids can pick up on. I think that's likely to be very effective. It was certainly effective in the computational models of learning to read that we have developed.
And now a word from our sponsor.
Hey, Melissa.
Hey, Aimee.
So let's talk about who we met at IDA, Tumbleweed.
Oh, I love Tumbleweed's decodable books, and they're for striving readers in grades 2 through 6. My favorite thing about them, in addition to the storylines, is the inclusion of comprehension, spelling, and vocabulary activities.
Yes, and there's no guessing because they took out the visual distractions. They still have illustrations, but not right next to the print.
And Tumbleweed is easy to implement with any core or intervention program. Their teacher guides are jam-packed with multimodal approaches.
Check them out at tumbleweedpublishing.com. Hi, this is Aimee Rodenroth, and as part of the Dyslexia Duo podcast team and owner of Discovery Dyslexia Services, I want to talk to you about my business. Our COUT-trained team offers expert virtual or in-person therapy located in Prosper, Texas, using proven dyslexia curricula like Take Flight, Build, MTA, Alphabetic Phonics, and Reading by Design. We also provide crucial independent evaluations and advocacy services. Don't wait. Empower your child today. Visit www.discovereed.com to learn more. That again is www.discovereed.com. Discovereed, covering all your dyslexia needs. Let's return to the show.
So I guess my question to you too is that thinking about how fluency develops, if this is kind of a general question, I'm probably asking you for a specific answer, and I'm sorry about that. But on average, how long does it take for automatic fluent reading to develop? And if you could compare and contrast an average reader to a dyslexic reader.
Okay, so you want to get me in trouble. So I think one of the things that we have to be careful about is typically developing kids versus dyslexic kids, where I've been giving talks on writing things recently in which I try to point out that the needs of the typically developing kids and the needs of dyslexic kids may not be, they aren't entirely the same. But let's just talk about reading development, okay? How long should it take the kid to get off the ground? I mean, what would we consider adequate progress? There's criteria out there, but let's say just roughly we're aiming for a second grade reader, third grade reader, fourth grade reader who's at or above grade level. How long should it take to really get going? And I think there's diverging views on this that are going to have to get worked through. Right now, quite a lot of circumstantial evidence suggesting that basic skills instruction is now taking up more of the school day. It's starting earlier because now in a lot of locations, people are starting in pre-K, and it's ending later because you have people doing phonics instruction and other basic skills instruction through grades 3 and 4 and possibly beyond. So there's the current view, I think, from the quote unquote science of reading is a kind of reaction to what the mistakes of whole language. There wasn't enough basic skills instruction in whole language. Lots of kids didn't get adequate instruction of that sort, and people don't want to make that mistake again. What we have in place right now is a lot of instruction, a lot of phonics. The UFLI materials are certainly a lot of patterns over, K through 2 or longer. And what we have now is a lot of instruction in a lot of components of reading, including ones that were never taught in the past, because people have learned that these components exist and they think that teaching them is necessary because learning to read is unnatural. So right now, I think it's taking a long time. And the concern is that we've turned learning to read into a long slog with good intentions, right? The intention is to not leave any kid behind, to make sure they get adequate instruction. But what I've said is, you can overdo it too. You want to teach them enough so that they achieve liftoffs, they break the code, they can start learning from other experiences, rather than spending all of this time trying to teach the whole thing. My view of how much time this should take and what's happening in many science of reading programs is quite different. I think it should take, it depends when you start. Let's say you're starting in kindergarten and leave pre-K, for language development and development of knowledge of the world. Let's just talk about kindergarten and on. I think that you should be able to bring the kid into the code and get to this point where you've cracked the code, the kid understands, implicitly sort of knows, catches on to what there is to learn, and is going to speed up their learning because they're going to be able to learn from more than just explicit instruction. I think that should be like beginning of second grade. It should be done because I think if you look at Goff's old stuff about breaking the code, he thought, and this was in the 80s, he thought it should be done by the end of first grade. And maybe that's still realistic, but it's not third grade with a huge amount of time devoted to explicit instruction. It's enough instruction to get the child off the ground and in a serious way. And I have to repeat that the instruction is essential. It's just a question of how much. And in my view, again, there are kids who are learning more slowly for a variety of reasons. There are kids who are learning more quickly. But certainly second grade, that's the point where, the kid understands the code. And now we're starting to really chug here. I think is still realistic.
I agree. I think that what kills me is that some of the students that walk into my door are in fourth grade and they've never received any kind of diagnosis. They are reading 2 grade levels below. It's just heartbreaking to know that's the case out there.
Everything I just said has to be taken against the background of we're paying attention to these kids' development early on, right? We are looking at children who could be at risk for reading or language or other sorts of issues. So the worst thing of all is everything I've said is moot if the kid isn't getting adequate instruction in the early grades. So clearly that's crucial. We do, as part of the science of reading laws in most states, there is the screening component, and there is some effort to identify who it is who's going to need tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 kind of instruction. I can't really speak to how well this is playing out in the schools,
Mhm.
because there's always the question of how it's implemented. But in principle, the idea is good, right? You screen the kid, you use their own behavior to figure out what kind of additional instruction does this kid need. Some of them are going to move ahead more quickly. Some of them are going to need more additional explicit instruction. In principle, that sounds like an absolutely reasonable way to proceed. Clearly, there are school districts and situations where this is not working because you get the kid at 4th grade because everybody's been saying, oh, he'll catch up. It's no problem.
Yeah.
We're trying to avoid that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a big team effort. And I know that there's a lot of good people on the side of getting that done.
Yeah, definitely.
So when I was in public ed, and I was considered the dyslexia evaluator for a really large district out here, and like 56,000 students, and I had to go around and do assessments, and then I go to at the time 504 SPED, the ARD meetings to go through. And I can remember this one campus in this one classroom, there were referral after referral for his students. And then after a while, I had to sit down and I was like, the potential to have 23 second graders, 15 of them be dyslexic is unheard of.
Right.
And it turned out it was more dyslexia than
Yeah. Oh,
dyslexia. So how can we prevent from misidentifying that?
clearly, we're trying to spread serious research-based information about the learner, but also about what kinds of experiences are going to be beneficial. We're all trying to figure out what the best things are, how to spend that instructional time in K1, 2, and possibly other years. And it's clear that we should be teaching the code. We should be teaching them how to sound out words. We should be teaching them in ways that also incorporate learning the meanings of the words, because a lot of kids won't know the words. There's a lot of agreement that there needs to be a big push there related to explicit instruction. I think we can do a better job in terms of picking what we teach and how we teach it so that we can be more effective and more efficient. But let's just say we're all agreed that there's going to be a push here in the early grades to help the kid get into the code, and in particular, learning how the spelling patterns relate to sounds and meanings. Now, I believe if you structure the kid's experience intelligently and build on things we know about learning from similarity and so on, the kid can make rapid progress and start moving to the next level relatively early. But there's still many issues that are up in the air about how to spend that instruction time and what to focus on. That's
Yeah,
for sure.
For sure.
We were talking a little bit ago about getting the kids identified early so they can get to 2nd grade and be ready to read.
Yeah.
How do we recommend clinicians, people who are doing the evaluations, how do we recommend that they integrate those cognitive science findings into their recommendations? What should we do better on that end?
I don't know if I'm going to be able to say anything that is an advance on what you already do or already know. The screening that's going on should be looking at things like, does the kid recognize letters? Can they associate a sound with the letter? Not phonemes, just the sounds that kids are usually taught when they learn an alphabet song or when they're playing out with using alphabet books and stuff like that. T is T and stuff like that. The kid definitely needs to be able to recognize the letters and have a sound associated with them. There is some basic knowledge related to print, but a lot of the screening is already getting into, does the kid know how to sound things out? And does the kid know how to use this knowledge to read? I think the main thing is some basic knowledge of print and also looking at their language. So you tell me, are we doing an adequate job of assessing not just their print knowledge, basic print skills and preparedness, but also their knowledge of language? There's certainly vocabulary and ability to say sentences of a certain kind of complexity and so on. I'm wondering, because I suspect that we aren't, are we doing an adequate job of looking at kids' language preparedness, not just their reading preparedness?
I think that's a huge area that needs improvement. I see a lot of children that are missing the boat on some of those areas, with especially vocabulary. That was not the case even just 5-10 years ago.
Why do you think that is?
I think because of
screen time.
technology.
I think you're probably right. And there's some research that is starting to show up about, oh, we've really made our bed and now we have to sleep in it, teach it. Now we have to teach in it. Screens are having pernicious effects on many aspects of early development. So, parents and small children looking at screens in parallel rather than talking to each other.
Right.
One of the things Mary Ellen McDonald has pointed out is these screens are a way to get exposure to language, sure, but they don't have that production interactive aspect that's really absolutely key. And the screens, of course, aren't as effective a way to learn new words and so on as actual use for a purpose. So I feel like we had a lot of research which says parental speech to children is a really important source of language. So talk to your kids and let them talk and all this other stuff. Now we have a cultural development in which people are doing that less. There's also some evidence that people are reading less to their children. That reading to your kids or with your kids, children's books are a really important source of new words, new sentence constructions, and knowledge of things that aren't in your immediate experience, like knowledge of other parts of the world. So when we were getting the message that reading with your kids is really important and it has all these beneficial effects, there's technology that's starting to interfere with it, and now parents are doing it less. I just feel this is pretty awful development.
It is. We were talking, and it was something I had read a while back about how younger parents are reading to their children less because it's not engaging for the parent. And I thought, oh my God.
Yeah, take away your parenting license. It's appalling to see the parallel screenplay with a kid and a parent. And the speech production part is so important. Mary Ellen's book is called More Than Words. And it really is about, from infancy on through old age, how the production aspect of language is really crucial to mental health, memory, learning, reading. And so if these other kind of technologies are squeezing that out, we got to do something. It's not good.
It's an emergency.
I feel like it is an emergency. I really do. There are several emergencies going on right now, but that is one of them.
Just a little funny. My son is 26 and he was asking me the other day if I wanted to go to the Burger Vault. And I said, Burger Vault? That's a weird name for a place. He said, yeah. And he showed me the name of it and it was Vault, VAULT. And I was like, Brendan, it's all. And I showed him my mouth, all. And I said, repeat after me, all. And he's 26. And he was like, he had to correct that sound. And I was thinking,
of course, there are these words that we read and we mispronounce because we only read them, and they're kind of funny. The Simpsons did a wonderful one about Gone with the Wind, where they go, oh, I've never heard that one. Somebody very clever was making, but some of those are okay, and there's an explanation for them, right? They occur in text, so they don't occur so much in speech. The reason that you need to have kids reading a lot is because in the beginning, your development of language is all depend on speech and talking and all these things. But there's a transition. So when you make it into reading, then texts become the main vehicle for increasing your knowledge of language, because there's lots of words that appear that don't appear in everyday speech, and sentence constructions and all sorts of other things that are really characteristic of text, but you don't get them in everyday speech. So if you take the bigger picture, it's not just we got to talk more with our kids and we got to let them talk and go back and forth. Right. It's we got to talk more and get them into reading, because there's that payoff that comes from reading and it doesn't happen from speech.
This is true. So let's talk a little bit about the reading wars. They're nice and strong. They've been going on for forever. A professor that I follow on LinkedIn, and he's very whole language, but he's also uses language that will incite, honestly. So he's trying to get attention, but he's very whole language. And I don't have a problem with whole language. I don't have a problem with phonics, but I do think there's a happy medium that we can meet in the middle. So do you think that the reading wars has been misunderstood?
It's not that they've been misunderstood. It's that they're always changing a little bit. So these issues can be resolved for the most part if you think developmentally. So you have to think in terms of what happens over time as the child is developing language and reading. The problem with whole language was they really greatly underestimated how the early part of learning to read works, how getting into the system works, how you get the kid off the ground, and by the way, where most of the problems usually arise. So they did not do an adequate job with basic skills instruction. So developmentally, whole language, using that kind of approach, which was text-based and context-based and so on, using that at the onset of reading, that was a fundamental error. That is a fundamental error. Now, science of reading, we say child's language matters, child's understanding of how print works and the sort of basic skills mechanics needs to get worked on far more than in this other approach. So we're going to do that. And what's still up in the air is, okay, what's the best way? How much? How can we get this to do this efficiently and effectively so that we can move on? But if you grant that, yep, we're going to do a much better job on the basic skills instruction, then that will get the kid to the point where they can start to benefit from the kind of activities that the folks in whole language thought were fundamental. So I think if you think about it developmentally as, yeah, we need instruction to get the child off the ground. We're going to need to continue to have some instruction. It doesn't go away, but we're going to try to get the child to the point where they can benefit from reading texts. Well, then we are going to have to structure their experiences related to texts in ways that promote further learning. So it's more like what the whole language people had in mind, but it's later. It's after the child has acquired some basic skills and overcome the obstacles that sometimes arise in that early phase. So it can't be just whole language.
Yeah. No, I can remember a teacher when I was a young teacher, like first starting. And I was like, this little person's not reading. What do I do? She goes, oh, get him some books he likes, and then he'll start reading.
It's true that people had a lot of faith in kids' ability to just figure it out. I think that was not quite right. There are kids, of course, who do, either because they get instruction in the home or because they don't need a huge amount of instruction. There's some kids who catch on very quickly, more quickly than others for a variety of reasons. But most of the kids need to have that instruction and good instruction in order to get off the ground so that they can start doing all these other wonderful things with reading, right? And all the stuff we want to get them to. But you can't just skip ahead, right? You have to actually do the preliminary sort of work.
Yeah. So if you were to have listeners take away one idea of language at the speed of sight, what would it be?
I think it is about the connection between language and thinking about reading as another kind of language and how the two are really intimately tied. And thinking about the disagreements that have occurred, questions about, given the nature of print, given the nature of language, what kind of experiences does the child need to promote development? And how are they similar and how are they different? I think that the message I'd really like to convey is, look, this is an ongoing effort. We have a pretty good idea of the things the kids need to learn. We have a pretty good idea of things that should be done and shouldn't be done. We are still working out how to make that effective for all kids. And we still have regressive people who don't really want to change from what they've been comfortable with in the whole language tradition. I think it's an ongoing project, and there are going to be bumps in the road. So right now, there's a lot of instruction going on, maybe too much instruction. Maybe there's instruction about things that aren't really essential, and we could kind of recalibrate that a bit and do a better job. I hope people don't panic if that kind of recalibration is needed, because it means that we are learning from experience. We are doing the best that we can, trying to figure out the best methods. And that's going to require some revision and reconsideration as we get to the point where we really reach our goals, which are making it easier for teachers to succeed at teaching to read and making it easier for kids to learn how to read. Don't panic. Don't panic. Don't panic.
And help everybody realize how important it is.
It is totally important. We are on the right track. And I think the best thing, the most positive thing is there's a ton of stuff from research that we're still going to be able to bring into the science, like thinking of learning as being similarity-based. It's not about teaching kids a bunch of rules. The rules are like too abstract. You want them to be based on things on similarity because that's what your brain, in this sort of unconscious implicit learning mechanism, that's what it loves. It just eats up similarity. So we'll be able to incorporate more stuff and it'll get better. But we want to beware of the ideologues who say, oh, we know all how to do this. We just have to stick to my program. It'll work just fine.
And I think what makes me kind of hopeful is that, I've been in situations where there's been teachers in place for a really long time, and they just do the same thing year after year without really analyzing the needs of those students. Everybody's got different needs in that classroom. And I think what makes me kind of hopeful is that we can now look at each student, as we should individually, according to their needs, and maybe structure what they need accordingly. That's my thought that I had.
I think that's true. I think you do have to differentiate kids, right? On the other hand, I feel like we need to keep our eyes on the prize, which is how well is this kid reading? Can they read new words? Are they stuck on this or that? I want the assessments of the kids' progress to really be mainly focused on what can I do to improve reading, not just performance on some phoneme deletion task or something. That's not reading. I want to know about what's affecting their reading and not putting new obstacles in the way, trying to get the kid to the point where they're reading and starting to expand their knowledge from reading would be really great.
Absolutely. All right. So we have something called lightning round. So you can just give us a word or a phrase, first thing that pops into your head. Okay.
Oh, that could be really embarrassing for me, couldn't it?
No, you're going to be great.
If it is, we have an editor who will. But I get you for sure. Okay. All right. Most misunderstood concept in reading research.
Phoneme.
Ah, very good.
One myth about how children learn to read.
That it's just a kind of discovery process in a literacy-rich environment.
Yeah.
That it's just self-discovery. We want to enable discovery, but first you got to get some foundation.
What slows reading development the most?
A lack of experience, a lack of opportunities to practice, a lack of feedback about performance, and instruction that is kind of deals with side issues and not the really crucial stuff, which is, what is this word? What does this word mean? How does this word combine with other words to make a meaningful sentence? Staying focused on things that have the biggest payoff for improving actual reading and is the goal. And then, of course, the thing that slows it is if you're just teaching the kid, language has lots of properties. Was this supposed to be a one-word answer? Language has lots of properties. There's a million things you could teach. You could teach these things endlessly. I spent my life studying language. There's a lot of cool things about them, but you don't have to teach all of those things. You need to teach things so it will get the kids reading to progress. And I think that's a crucial question.
Absolutely.
Okay, so dyslexia, under-identified or misidentified?
Oh, I don't know what the actual data are on it. In a large part of the world, it's still under-identified. But I really can't speak to it. Hopefully there are studies that give us some actual data. But in many settings, certainly from talking to people, and which is it's a sample of a certain sort, it's still tough to get the kid identified and to get an appropriate sort of intervention or remediation.
I agree.
Okay, so in systems and reform, policy change or grassroots change, what would make the biggest impact or fastest impact ever is equally?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I'm going to waffle. The history of the last 20 years is that the meaningful change, which is the science of reading movement and the state laws, came from grassroots stuff. It did not come from the state departments of education or the schools of education saying, hey, we need to change how we're doing things. It came from real dissatisfaction and then also arming parents and other interested teachers and other interested people with some information like my book did and Hanford's podcast did and so on. The recent history is it took from the bottom up. I think we got to get the institutions on board, and it's not just teacher education, it's education of the superintendents and the principals and the professors in the colleges of education and so on. It can't just be from the bottom up. That has been effective. now we're getting to the crunch, and I'd like to see some movement on the institutional side.
Okay, I think this one's fun. If you weren't studying reading and the research behind it, what field would you be in?
That's a good question. I'll tell you, for a brief period, I actually did some research on songbirds. So, they're little, very small birds that sing, and their songs are very complicated. They're complex songs, and they have some properties that are similar to language, and they have some variation and impairments, so to speak. And the birds were really wonderful. The songs are really wonderful and complex, and the neural systems for them could be studied in a way that you can't study the human brain. And it was a fascinating thing to understand that also had implications for thinking about human language. I certainly enjoyed doing that. I don't know if I would have done a whole career of it, but it was a really interesting thing.
Then you could just keep going into whales and how they
Whales.
communicate.
Whales
yeah.
are a songbird.
When I was a graduate student, one of my very first papers, it was in the era when they were doing the first studies of chimpanzees using sign language, and everyone was going, oh, the chimpanzees can talk, Coco can talk, oh, yes, they can talk. I wrote a bunch of papers saying, this is not talking, and here's why. And the animal language and animal communication are fascinating, and they definitely have enormous capacities, and there's just wonderful research now. But in the old days, what people were saying about the talking chimpanzees and talking gorillas was just kind of exaggerated. And so that was one of the first things I actually studied.
Oh,
It's
interesting.
interesting. And I think it's because you can definitely correct me if I'm wrong, because I just have sketchy knowledge, if any, about that. It's because they had been taught a finite amount of sign language. And so it really wasn't unique communication.
Oh, it was more like, I can tell you what it was like for some of them. A cup is the name for a kind of object. And cup, it refers to a whole bunch of different cups that have different shapes and sizes and so on. So cup is the name for something. Okay, now imagine that you didn't know what a name was. Like you didn't understand, oh, cup. I understand that sound there refers to all different kinds of cups. So humans start naming from, it's something that's pretty hardwired. And chimpanzees knew all about cups, and they wanted cups, and wanted to communicate about cups, but they didn't get the idea that the word cup was the name for cups. What they would basically do is they would use the word cup in order to get a cup. Instead of using the word to point out, oh, that's a cup, that's a chair, that's a banana, they would use it. Cup, cup, cup meant they give me the cup. And long story short, just imagine if you had to teach a species what it meant to have something having a name like cup or bottle or banana. You could be really smart and you could be really communicative, but you'd be missing something really basic about language. And I believe that's one of the things that other species are missing.
Okay, so going back to the songbird. Oh no, I shouldn't be asking.
You should be studying these things too, you see.
Yeah, there we go. Do songbirds have a unique song each time? Or
It depends on the species. Some of them, they vary in ways that are so interesting. For example, some of them have a song and the father passes the song on to the offspring, and it's the father. It's the father. And then once they've learned the song, they learn the song and they keep it tuned to the song by listening to each other. So if, for example, they learned a song and then they stopped hearing other birds, they would forget the song. It would go away. So you learn the song and then you keep it going by using it, basically. But there are other birds that relearn the song every spring. Their brains are different. Yeah. It's a little like human language in that it's variable and it's complex and it's a little easier to study. And the birds are very cute and it was fun.
Before I opened my business that I have now, I was trying to convince my husband to open a Wild Birds Unlimited store because I love all the birds at the feeders. And we live out in the country and we get a lot of really very unique birds. And when I had seen the city out this way, and I call it my old lady face. I'm like, oh, blue jay.
It might be scientific respect. The science of songbirds is a really rich and interesting area and has revealed things about how brains work in not just in the birds, but in giving you new ideas about how brains might work in general. It's a fun thing and very interesting.
It is.
Speaking
it
of
is.
birds, there's that bird Apollo on YouTube, and he's won the Guinness Book of World Records by how
Yes.
many words he knows.
Oh, wow.
Yes. So the gray parrots are really smart, and it's a bit, they're smart. No question. We don't want to underestimate them. But if you look at the songbirds, leave aside the African gray parrots for a moment, the songbirds are only doing implicit learning. There's no teacher there saying, no, do this, not that. So now we have a species where you can only learn through the statistical learning kind of thing. How does that work? You can study it in a way that you can't study in humans. But I just point that out. So that's a species that learns only by this underlying kind of statistical method. And they can get pretty complicated songs that way, but they don't talk.
Interesting.
That's fascinating. So this whole conversation, let's be honest, has been super fascinating, including the bird talk and the
Yes.
cocoa and all of that.
Yeah.
But we appreciate your time that you spent with
Absolutely.
us. And I can't say how much we appreciate it because I don't have the words right now. But thank you for your time and for your
Yes.
energy and contributing so much to our field.
Thank you for the work you do. I think it's the really challenging part, being on the front lines.
It really is.
Well,
yeah.
we're
I really do.
appreciative of the team effort, and we'll just keep fighting the good fight, right?
That's right.
Thank you, sir. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Take care. Oh, hey, we got to say our goodbyes, Aimee
Oh, that's right. Okay. This is Aimee,
and Melissa.
and we're the
Dyslexia Duo.
Until next time. Bye.
Bye.
The Dyslexia Duo hosts are Melissa Dean,
And Aimee Rodenroth. The producer is Greg Rodenroth.
Dyslexia awareness is so important. Please share with your friends, family, and anyone who needs to know more about dyslexia.
Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X at the Dyslexia Duo.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.
Bye.